Episode of CrimePrint, the podcast where we delve into the most chilling and mysterious stories from criminal history. We are your hosts, Rebecca and Leo, and today we're exploring the mysterious death of Nancy Argentino.
Nancy was born into a traditional Italian family in Flatbush, New York in 1961. She was a typical 22-year-old with her whole life ahead of her, but fell in love with someone who had a hand in cutting her life short.
It was January 1983 at a local Howard Johnson motel. Nancy and her boyfriend, Jimmy Superfly Snuka, were in town for a wrestling show, as Jimmy was a WWF, now known as WWE, superstar with a career that was rising fast. The other guests at the Howard Johnson started notifying the front desk that they were hearing sounds of what appeared to be a man beating a woman. At 2 a.m, one of Nancy's sisters received a phone call to hear Nancy say, "He's chasing me." Then the phone went dead.
When the local police arrive, along with their K-9 unit, they see Jimmy dragging Nancy by the hair down a hallway. Their attempts to intervene were met with 235 pounds of brute strength. Jimmy was arrested and charged with third-degree assault and harassment charges. Nancy signed a third-degree assault affidavit indicating that Jimmy had not harmed her on January 18, 1983, nor at any other time in the past. Snuka pled guilty to minor harassment charges, donated $1,500 to the local Ronald McDonald House, and nothing else was ever spoken of this incident.
At this point, nobody from WWF really wanted to deal with Jimmy. He was doing cocaine in the car on the way to wrestling matches, and Nancy was the one who would make sure Jimmy was where he needed to be. In May of 1983, WWF was taping a live show in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Jimmy and Nancy, along with other wrestlers, arrive at the George Washington Motor Lodge in the early morning hours of May 10, 1983. During the day, Jimmy had filmed some matches for that night's broadcast, so he had been in and out of the motel room. He finishes his day around 9 p.m. Around midnight that same evening, the other wrestlers were awakened by flashing lights and sirens. They peered out their windows to find an ambulance outside of Jimmy and Nancy's room, along with crime scene tape. In 1983, Shirley Reeve was an Allentown paramedic. She was one of the first responders to the unconscious female 911 call that was received around midnight on May 11th. She accounts that Jimmy was standing in the open doorway with on-scene detectives. Nancy was lying in the bed under the sheet with dilated pupils. Shirley thought, "That's a sign of a head wound." She was finding it difficult to get any information on what may have happened from Jimmy. After a few minutes of coaxing him, she was able to learn that Jimmy and Nancy may have wrestled too hard the night before in the parking lot and she had hit her head. Jimmy had gone to his first match in the morning, and when he came back to the motel, Snuka indicated that Nancy was conscious but lethargic. He said he told Nancy he was going to film his next match and would check on her later. When he arrived back at the motor lodge, Nancy was having difficulty breathing. The Lehigh County Hospital, where Nancy had been taken, called her parents, and they spoke with Jimmy, who appeared to be upset and indicated that she had fallen and hit her head and that it was an accident.
Snuka is escorted back to the motor lodge from the hospital, where he was questioned by police and gives the first of many different accounts of what may have happened to Nancy. Snuka had already told the paramedics and hospital staff that he may have caused a head injury to Nancy.
After Nancy has been pronounced dead, Jimmy says the official story is as follows. It was a rainy night and they were driving to Allentown. On the way, Nancy needed to stop on the side of the highway to use the washroom. There was lots of traffic truck traffic, and on the way back to the car, Nancy slipped on the wet highway and fell and hit her head.
By mid-morning of May 11th, Jimmy's boss, Vince McMahon, asked another employee if he had heard about Jimmy and his girlfriend. That employee handed the phone to the detective who had just shown up at his door. Later that same day, Jimmy is released without any charges.
Nancy's family held a traditional 3-day Italian wake. During the second day, Jimmy Snuka, being led by Buddy Rogers, walked into the wake in short shorts, flip-flops, and a tank top, and was acting like a blubbering fool over Nancy's body. The only thing he said to Nancy's family, according to her sister Lorraine, was, "She looks terrible." The undertaker had heard Jimmy say this and explained to Nancy's father that he had a hard time getting her to look good due to a large bruise around her neck and cuts and abrasions all over her body.
Snuka went back to work and continued his rise to WWF stardom barely a few weeks after Nancy's passing. Allentown authorities went to Argentino's house in Flatbush, New York, and told her family they were ruling her death accidental due to a slip and fall on the side of the road.
Go.
According to her sister Louise, around the same time, a WWF promoter offered condolences along with $25,000.
Nancy's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit claiming Jimmy's negligence on the day Nancy died by letting her fall asleep knowing she had hit her head. Snuka failed to show up at the court hearing, which awarded the Argentino family $500,000. Nancy's family never received any of this settlement since Snuka filed for bankruptcy and didn't have to pay. Snuka's wrestling career took a slow decline, eventually ending with appearances at autograph shows. 30 years later, in 2011, 2 Allentown reporters were looking into cold cases and came across Nancy's. They attempted to file FOIA requests for all of the files. However, they were advised that the criminal case was considered cold but still open, and they could not access the case files from 1983. They were, however, able to gain access to all files from the wrongful death lawsuit. The reporters received a copy of Nancy's autopsy report that stated the following: injuries caused by a moving head striking a stationary object. The injuries were not consistent with a simple fall. There were scalp, facial, and body abrasions, and the magnitude and multiplicity of injuries were suggestive of, quote, mate abuse. The last sentence from the medical examiner states, quote, in view of the autopsy findings and the discrepancies in clinical history, I believe that the case should be investigated as a homicide until proven otherwise.
While the reporters were investigating the case, Snuka's book was released in December of 2012. This was the first time that Jimmy ever spoke about what happened in Allentown, as well as a final meeting between Vince McMahon himself and Allentown authorities. All other meetings with the parties involved had detailed recordings. This last transcript, however, lacked significant information for an hour-long interview, and the case went cold for the next 30 years.
According to Jimmy's current wife, Sharon, he could not read and write English, and McMahon was trusted to handle contracts and decisions that were required to be made. Sharon also says that on the day of that last interview, McMahon comes in with a briefcase and says, quote, it's done. The former police chief of Allentown states there is nothing recorded because nothing significant took place in the meeting that needed to be recorded.
Snuka also writes that Nancy ruined his life and that she was an on-again, off-again girlfriend, which often happens in the wrestling world. He also wrote he never put a hand on her. According to Nancy's sister Lorraine, Nancy's family adamantly denied both of these claims, and he was always with Nancy, and they always witnessed his quick temper. Over the last 30 years, Jimmy has told this story. There have always been slight changes made to every telling. A small detail omitted here, a large detail there. In
2014, the Lehigh County District Attorney officially reinvestigates the case. Charges are filed against Snuka for third-degree murder in 2015. However, during the court hearings, his dementia was so bad, the judge determined he was unable to stand trial. This is a case that causes debate as it has no real resolution. Do you think it was an accident? Was Snuka negligent? Was it intentional homicide? Leave us a comment and let us know what you might think.
That's all for this episode of CrimePrint. Join us next time as we continue to explore the darkest corners of criminal history. Don't forget to hit that bell to get notified about new episodes. Until next time, be safe and thank you for listening.